Other questions? Yeah.
So you know, I'm only partway through the book, but your characters do come across as very authentic.
Thank you.
Especially the French character, from what I know of French people. You made a comment earlier when you asked, answering the Joyce's question, the French people are very different than Americans. I'm curious to hear more about your impression on that.
You know, it's interesting. They are not immediately as open as Americans are, especially Californians. That what you'll find, and I had not lived in this area until I moved. I'm from the East Coast, just in case you didn't notice the accent. And I moved to Northern California from Paris, so I lived in LA for a few years, but that sort of doesn't count. And I was amazed by how immediately open people are in California. It's like, hello, who are you? Will you be my new best friend? And in Paris, it takes a really long time before anybody will begin to let you in. There are all kinds of rules of formality. Even when you go into a clothing store, you guys know this, you have to say hello to the saleswoman. You have to have like this exchange of conversation before you do anything. Here that would, I don't know, it would be a little weird. But there are many more kind of barriers of, or rules of proper behavior that in my mind create barriers. So I think it's a little bit of a challenge to get through those barriers. And one of the ways that it became easier for me, since I had babies in Paris, and my girls were in a French school. So the French, at that point in time, this was a while ago, Gillian's 25, so many years ago, the French were just starting at that point in time to be convinced that learning and speaking English was a really important thing. I think before that time they weren't. And so to have, if their friends had if their kids had an American friend, that would be an immediate in to learning French. So I became like popular because they could then, you know, set up play dates with my girls. So I felt like I got through some of those barriers to get to know the French. Then when you do, what's interesting is the connections are much deeper. I mean, I think my surprise when I moved to California is that everybody's immediately open and then it's hard to make real connections. When you get through those barriers with the French, the connections run very deep. The family connections are hugely important. I mean, they still have Sunday lunch at Grandma's house and everybody shows up. So there are just cultural differences that are kind of astounding. There are also a lot of myths about the French. I found that, I'm so curious whether the others, the three of you who lived in Paris right there, but I found that the French loved Americans when I lived there. I had no, you know, you always hear that bias about how much they hate Americans, and that just so wasn't true. And how curious they were about us, who we were, how we thought, how much they wanted to know us. So that created a kind of opening up and a chance to connect, too. There are lots of differences. I was just asked in an interview recently about, are the rules of sex different in Paris than here? And I don't really know. But certainly the French have affairs in affairs are much more accepted in France than they are here. It would not, I remember the first sort of shock to me when we moved there. My then husband was working with a company and he was setting up a company Christmas party, and he said, and of course we'll invite the spouses, and he was told the parties never include the spouses. Is that true for you guys when you were there? Yeah. And the reason why is you don't want the spouse finding out who you have been with lately or what the relationship is with everyone else. So life is kept very separate, business life, personal life, but affairs are much more common. The joke in lingerie shops is that the men come in and buy sexy lingerie in pairs, one for their wife and one for their mistress. And I think that their attitudes about sex then are very different. They're much, much less they're more open to those the rule bending, that monogamy isn't the standard. And that was a big surprise to me, and one of the things that gets explored in the novel is how do you, marriage is a tough thing, and relationships, this whole idea of setting up the man who's happily married and gets this hot tutor to work with for a week. Are you expected to be married and never be attracted to anyone else again in your life? Well, that's kind of impossible. So what happens when there's that first stirring of lust or desire, and how does that affect you and the marriage and everything else? And these are questions that are interesting to me because they're not easy, right? So that to me is the good stuff to write about, the stuff that isn't black or white, easily answered. And I thought that would be, especially when it takes place in France, where that stuff has happened so much more, territory worth exploring.